Did you know that nearly 1 in 20 people in the world meets the clinical criteria for narcissistic personality disorder? That may sound small, but think about it. In a lifetime, you will almost certainly cross paths with one, at work, in a relationship, or even in your family. And here's the frightening part. Studies show that those few can leave psychological scars deeper than any physical wound, because their power doesn't come from what they do once. It comes from how they rewrite your reality day after day. Psychologists have measured the toll. Victims of narcissistic manipulation often show cortisol levels, the stress hormone, as high as soldiers returning from combat. Imagine that, just trying to love or understand someone can push your body into the same survival mode as if you were in a war zone. That's the cost of trying to empathize with a narcissist. And if you've ever felt drained, doubted your own memory, or apologized for things you never did, you're not alone, and you're not broken. What you've lived through has an explanation. And once you see it clearly, everything changes. So if what I'm about to share speaks to you, even a little, make me a sign. Like this video, share it, write thank you in the comments, or subscribe. It changes everything for what comes next. Carl Jung once said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But what happens when that other personality is a narcissist? Instead of mutual transformation, you often end up dissolved in their narrative, rewritten as if your own story no longer belongs to you. Sigmund Freud, who coined the concept of narcissism in 1914, warned that some individuals become so self-invested that they cannot love others, only reflections of themselves. And modern research confirms what these early thinkers saw. A 2021 study from the American Psychological Association found that 6.2% of the population meets the criteria for narcissistic personality disorder, yet the impact they create feels far greater. Why? Because each interaction is like standing in front of a mirror that never shows your true reflection. If you've ever tried to empathize with a narcissist, you know the sensation. At first, you think you're bridging a gap, offering compassion, trying to understand their pain. You've been taught since childhood that empathy is the highest human virtue, a pathway to connection. Neuroscientists even show that when we empathize, mirror neurons in our brain fire, creating an almost physical resonance with the other person. But here's the paradox. When that resonance meets a narcissist, it doesn't echo back. It vanishes into silence. You feel drained, confused, questioning yourself. This is not a failure of your empathy. It's the illusion of understanding carefully constructed by someone who thrives on rewriting your sense of reality. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic emperor, wrote in his Meditations, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." When you empathize with someone healthy, your soul deepens. But with a narcissist, your soul becomes stained with their distortions. They project blame, manipulate memories, and make you doubt your own perceptions. Victims often describe it as walking through fog. One testimony from a survivor, published in Psychology Today, said, "I kept apologizing for things I hadn't done. I thought maybe I had forgotten, maybe I was too sensitive. But eventually I realized I was being erased." This is the danger Jung described when he warned of the shadow, the part of another person that, if you're not aware, can consume your light. The evidence is striking. In couples where one partner has narcissistic traits, researchers at Ohio State University found that empathy becomes a weapon rather than a bridge. The narcissistic partner will often acknowledge empathy only to twist it. For example, if you show concern about their stress, they may later accuse you of being controlling, as if your care was a form of surveillance. Empathy turns against you, and the more you give, the more it backfires. This is why so many intelligent, kind, capable individuals end up exhausted in these relationships. You're not weak. You're human. You're wired to respond to suffering. But you're dealing with someone who exploits that wiring. Carl Jung believed that people who fall into this trap are often those with a deep need to heal, to fix, to redeem. Your empathy becomes not just a tool, but an identity. And that's precisely what the narcissist hooks into. Seneca, another Stoic philosopher, once wrote, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." Narcissists know this instinctively. They make you imagine their wounds, their struggles, their endless injustices. And because you feel deeply, you suffer on their behalf. Yet the shocking truth is that many narcissists don't actually want healing. According to a longitudinal study in the Journal of Personality Disorders, most narcissistic individuals show little long-term improvement in empathy, even after therapy. The empathy deficit is structural, almost neurological. They don't lack stories to tell. they lack the capacity to truly see you. So why do you keep trying? Because your brain rewards you for it. Dopamine spikes when you believe you've finally broken through, when you see a flash of vulnerability in them. Neuroscientists call this intermittent reinforcement, the same mechanism that makes gambling addictive. You remember the rare moments when the narcissist seemed tender, apologetic, almost human. And those moments make you chase more, even though they vanish just as quickly. This isn't just psychology, it's biology, and understanding this is the first step to breaking free. Here lies the central illusion. You believe empathy will unlock connection, but with a narcissist, empathy is swallowed into a void. You are not seen, you are consumed. The Stoics would say the answer is not to stop caring, but to care wisely. Epictetus reminded his students, "It is not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." The reaction here is clarity. To know that when your reality feels rewritten, it's not a failure of memory, nor a lack of compassion, but the deliberate design of someone who depends on your confusion. You are not broken for failing to reach them. You are awakening to the fact that empathy, in this context, is not a bridge but a trap. And by naming the illusion, you begin to step out of the fog. This is the first liberation, to see clearly that not every soul you meet is capable of meeting you back. In 2011, neuroscientists in Germany ran brain scans on individuals diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. What they found was startling. The regions of the brain tied to empathy, particularly the anterior insula and the anterior cingulate cortex, showed far less activation compared to people without the disorder. In simple terms, when most of us witness another person in pain, our brain lights up as if we're experiencing a shadow of that pain ourselves. But in narcissists, the circuitry is muted, almost silent. Carl Jung would have called this a blind spot of the psyche, a part of the inner map that refuses to acknowledge the existence of another person's inner world. Think about what this means in everyday life. When you empathize, your mirror neurons fire. If you see someone cry, your own brain mimics the emotion, making you feel an echo of their sadness. This is why compassion feels natural, almost instinctive. But with narcissists, there's no echo. You can pour out your emotions, your tears, your vulnerabilities, and what comes back is either indifference or worse, manipulation. Freud described this as narcissistic withdrawal, where the narcissist retreats into their own self as if other people's realities don't exist. And here lies the paradox. They are often experts at mimicking empathy. They can say the right words, use the right gestures, but behind the mask there is no resonance. It's performance, not presence. A famous study published in Personality and Individual Differences tested this. Narcissists scored surprisingly high on cognitive empathy, the ability to intellectually recognize what someone else might be feeling. But they scored dramatically lower on effective empathy, the ability to genuinely feel that emotion with you. That's why a narcissist can say, "I understand you're upset," yet still continue the behavior that hurts you. They recognize your pain on a surface level, but it doesn't land in their body. It doesn't stir their conscience. Carl Jung would argue that this is the shadow masquerading as light, awareness without transformation. For you, the empathizer, this creates a brutal loop. You feel seen for a moment when they acknowledge your pain, but soon you notice their actions contradict the words. Your nervous system, wired to seek consistency, starts to spin. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, and it's one of the most destabilizing human experiences. You think, if they understand me, why don't they change? If they see my suffering, why do they repeat it? These unanswered questions keep you hooked, because your brain is designed to resolve inconsistency. But with a narcissist, resolution never comes. The blind spot is structural, not circumstantial. Seneca once said, "To be everywhere is to be nowhere." When you pour your empathy into someone who cannot receive it, you scatter yourself. You become everywhere in their narrative, but nowhere in your own truth. Neuroscience explains why this feels so exhausting. Your brain is spending enormous amounts of energy firing mirror neurons, producing oxytocin, the bonding hormone, and even releasing cortisol when stress rises, all in an attempt to connect. Yet none of that biochemical investment returns to you. Imagine working day after day and never being paid. That's what your nervous system experiences when trying to empathize with a narcissist. Even modern therapy struggles with this. In clinical settings, many therapists report that narcissistic patients resist deep work because true empathy would destabilize their fragile self-concept. To feel another's pain would mean admitting their own limitations, and that's intolerable. Freud once noted that narcissists exchange reality for a fiction of invulnerability. Neuroscience confirms this. Brain scans show that when narcissists are confronted with personal failure, the regions linked to shame and self-reflection spike, but instead of processing those feelings, they often redirect them outward as anger or blame. The blind spot protects them, but it blinds you if you try to step into it. So what does this teach us? First, that your struggle to connect is not a failure of your empathy. It's biology meeting biology, a nervous system wired to resonate crashing against one wired to deflect. Second, it reveals why empathy alone will never transform the relationship. Jung insisted that transformation requires confrontation with the shadow, but narcissists rarely confront theirs. And third, it shows why your healing must begin not with giving more empathy, but with redirecting it inward, protecting the resonance that makes you human. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." Applied here, the wisdom is sharp. If empathy is not returned, do not keep pouring it. If compassion is not reciprocated, recognize the blind spot. This doesn't make you less kind, less human, less spiritual. It makes you aware. And awareness is the first step to freedom. Because the truth is this: when you try to empathize with a narcissist, you are looking for a mirror that has no reflection. And the longer you search, the more you forget what your own face looks like. The neuroscience doesn't just explain their blindness, it explains your exhaustion. And now that you see it, you can stop mistaking the void for connection. Carl Jung believed that each of us carries a shadow, the hidden parts of our psyche we deny or repress. He warned that if we fail to confront our shadow, it will be projected outward onto others. And when you encounter a narcissist, you are face to face with a master of projection. They don't just show you who they are, they reflect back fragments of yourself, twisted and distorted. This is why relationships with narcissists feel so disorienting. It's not only their behavior that confuses you, it's the way they make you question whether the darkness you see is theirs or yours. Take this simple truth: narcissists often accuse you of the very things they secretly do. If they lie, they call you dishonest. If they manipulate, they claim you are manipulative. Jung described this as the shadow at work, a psychological defense mechanism that shifts what is unbearable in the self onto another. Modern psychology confirms it. A study published in Psychological Science in 2018 found that people with high narcissistic traits are significantly more likely to engage in projection. They rewrite your reality by making you carry their shadow. And the more you try to empathize, the more you begin to internalize their accusations. Freud noticed this too. He called it projective identification, where someone not only projects their unwanted qualities onto you, but pressures you into acting them out. For example, a narcissist who feels deep insecurity might constantly suggest that you're jealous or needy. Over time, you begin to doubt your stability, you over-explain yourself, and suddenly you appear exactly as they've described. This is the insidious cycle. Their shadow becomes your mask. You think you're seeing yourself clearly, but you're trapped in their distortion. One survivor wrote in a clinical testimony, "I began to feel like I was everything he accused me of. If he said I was selfish, I apologized. If he said I was cold, I tried harder to be warm. It never occurred to me that none of this was about me. It was his own reflection." Jung's insight is vital here. What disturbs us in others often reveals something within ourselves. But with narcissists, the danger is mistaking their unresolved shadow for your own. The difference is subtle but critical. The Stoics had their version of this wisdom long before Jung. Epictetus told his students, "Remember, it is not he who reviles you or strikes you who insults you, but your opinion that these things are insulting." In other words, the accusation only has power if you take it in. But when a narcissist relentlessly mirrors their shadow onto you, even the strongest mind begins to crack. And here lies the trap. Empathy accelerates the process. Because you feel deeply, you imagine maybe they're right, maybe you're blind to your flaws, maybe this conflict is your fault. What begins as compassion turns into self-doubt. Neuroscience again shows why this is so destabilizing. When you're accused unfairly, your amygdala, the brain's alarm system, activates. It pushes you into a state of hypervigilance, searching for evidence that you might indeed be wrong. Meanwhile, your prefrontal cortex, the rational part of your brain, is overloaded trying to reconcile contradictions. Studies on gaslighting victims reveal elevated cortisol levels, disrupted sleep, and even memory fragmentation. This isn't just emotional pain. It's biological warfare waged on your nervous system. Jung insisted that true individuation, becoming whole, comes from recognizing what belongs to you and what does not. A narcissist clouds that boundary. They hand you pieces of their shadow and insist they're yours. They accuse you of things that reflect their own hidden shame. And because you care, because you empathize, you pick up the burden. Seneca once wrote, "We are more often frightened than hurt, and we suffer more in imagination than in reality." With a narcissist, imagination becomes weaponized. You imagine you are the selfish one, the unstable one, the cruel one. And in that moment, their shadow has succeeded in colonizing your mind. But here is the shift you must see. What they mirror back to you is not truth, but their refusal to face themselves. Their inability to own their darkness becomes the script you are forced to live. Yet the very fact that you question, that you self-reflect, that you feel guilt, these are not signs of narcissism. They are proof of your humanity. Narcissists rarely ask themselves, "Am I the problem?" You do. That alone separates you. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." In dealing with narcissists, the task is to make conscious what belongs to them and refuse to let it dictate your story. Their shadow is not your fate. Their projection is not your identity. The mirror they hold up does not show your true reflection. And when you see that, when you recognize the illusion of the mirror, something shifts. The spell breaks. You no longer have to play the role they've assigned you. Instead, you begin the process of reclaiming your image, your voice, your truth. And that is the first real step toward freedom. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The nearer a man comes to a calm mind, the closer he is to strength." Yet when you find yourself entangled with a narcissist, calmness feels impossible. Your compassion, the very quality that should empower you, begins to feel like a chain around your neck. Seneca warned about this long before psychology had the language for narcissism. He said, "He who is everywhere is nowhere." When your empathy is scattered into someone who cannot receive it, you dissolve. And what once felt like a strength becomes your greatest vulnerability. You've likely felt this paradox yourself. You try to care, to understand, to support. You think that maybe if you show enough patience, enough love, enough compassion, something will shift. This is the human instinct. Neuroscience shows that compassion activates reward pathways in the brain, releasing oxytocin and dopamine. It feels good to help others, to relieve suffering. But when the other person is a narcissist, compassion doesn't lead to relief. Instead, it becomes a trap. Each act of kindness is twisted. Each attempt to connect is turned into leverage. Suddenly you find yourself giving not because it helps, but because you fear what will happen if you stop. Epictetus, the Stoic slave turned teacher, gave a warning that feels like it was written precisely for this dynamic. When someone is properly grounded in life, they shouldn't have to look outside themselves for approval. But the narcissist thrives on external approval, and your compassion feeds that hunger. They will take your empathy not as love, but as fuel. The more you try to soothe them, the more dependent they become on your emotional labor. And here lies the cruel cycle. The more you give, the less they respect you. Modern psychology calls this the compassion trap. Studies on abusive relationships reveal that victims often stay not out of weakness, but out of empathy. They believe their partner's pain stories, they internalize their wounds, they think, "If I leave, they'll fall apart." In a survey conducted by the National Domestic Violence Hotline, nearly 70% of respondents admitted they stayed longer in toxic relationships because they felt responsible for their partner's emotional well-being. This is the tragic irony. Compassion becomes the prison bars. Carl Jung saw this in mythic terms. He believed compassion without boundaries invites possession by the other's shadow. Think of the ancient Greek myth of Narcissus. He stares into the water, captivated by his reflection, unable to see the world around him. But what the myth often leaves out is echo, the nymph cursed to repeat only what others say. She wastes away trying to be heard, but her voice is only a reflection of his. This is the fate of unchecked compassion with a narcissist. You become the echo, repeating their reality, losing your own. And here's the hard truth. Compassion alone does not heal a narcissist. Freud's early patients with narcissistic traits resisted therapy not because they lacked intelligence, but because empathy made them defensive. To admit vulnerability would shatter the fragile self-image they protect at all costs. Modern neuroscience backs this up. Brain imaging studies show heightened activity in regions tied to self-threat when narcissists are confronted with criticism or compassion that feels exposing. Rather than opening them, it hardens them. So what can you do? The Stoics offer clarity. They never said don't care. They said care wisely. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Compassion becomes toxic when it forgets this boundary. You cannot control how someone receives your empathy. You cannot make another person whole by sacrificing your own wholeness. The alternative is not coldness, but clarity. Compassion with boundaries. Kindness with discernment. A willingness to help, but never at the cost of your sanity. In modern therapy, this is called radical acceptance. You see the narcissist as they are, not as you hope they could be. You accept that your compassion cannot rewire their blind spot. And in that acceptance, you begin to redirect your empathy inward, where it can actually heal. Remember this. Empathy without wisdom is exploitation waiting to happen. The Stoics knew it. Jung saw it in the archetypes. Neuroscience confirms it in the way your brain depletes under endless compassion without return. When compassion turns into a trap, the answer is not to stop caring, but to learn where your care ends and theirs must begin. Because real strength isn't found in giving until you're empty. It's in knowing when to stop giving to someone who only takes. That's not cruelty. That's wisdom. And it's the wisdom the Stoics wanted you to carry like armor in a world where not everyone has earned the gift of your compassion. In 2014, researchers at the University of Copenhagen ran a large-scale study on relationships with individuals who displayed high narcissistic traits. The results were sobering. Partners who constantly tried to empathize reported significantly higher levels of anxiety, depression, and chronic stress than the general population. Their cortisol levels, the hormone of stress, were persistently elevated, comparable to people living in war zones or enduring long-term workplace harassment. It's a brutal reminder that empathizing with a narcissist is not just emotionally exhausting. It leaves scars on the body itself. Carl Jung once warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Many who live in the orbit of a narcissist feel precisely that, like their fate is sealed. They think, maybe this is just how relationships are. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe this is my destiny. But neuroscience shows it isn't destiny. It's trauma. Prolonged exposure to narcissistic manipulation activates the same regions of the brain involved in post-traumatic stress disorder. Victims often describe memory fog, difficulty concentrating, even physical symptoms like migraines or stomach pain. This is not weakness. It's the nervous system's survival mode. Freud noticed early on that patients entangled with narcissistic personalities often developed what he called neurotic suffering, symptoms that had no clear medical cause but were deeply real. Modern psychiatry has expanded this, calling it complex trauma. Unlike a single traumatic event, complex trauma arises from repeated small violations. The dismissive glance, the mocking tone, the way your empathy is twisted against you. One study published in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease found that survivors of long-term narcissistic abuse were twice as likely to develop symptoms of chronic fatigue and immune dysfunction compared to other trauma survivors. Empathy, when continually exploited, doesn't just drain your emotions. It erodes your health. And yet here lies the cruel paradox. People who are the most empathic, the most compassionate, often endure the longest. A survey by the National Institute of Mental Health revealed that individuals scoring high on measures of empathy were nearly 40% more likely to remain in toxic relationships. Why? Because their very strength, their ability to feel and care, becomes the glue that keeps them stuck. They keep hoping, keep trying, keep believing that more compassion will change the outcome. This is why so many intelligent, capable people whisper, "How did I end up here?" The answer is not stupidity. It's the betrayal of empathy turned inward. Seneca offered a warning centuries ago. We are more often frightened than hurt, and we suffer more in imagination than in reality. With narcissists, the suffering becomes both imagined and real. You imagine their pain, you carry it, you bleed for it, and your own reality begins to collapse. The psychological toll isn't just the exhaustion of constant giving, it's the corrosion of your identity. Victims often describe feeling like a shell of who they once were. A 2019 clinical report from the Trauma Research Foundation documented this exact phenomenon. Empathy eroded into self-erasure. Patients said things like, "I don't know what I like anymore," or "I don't recognize myself." The narcissist rewrites your reality until your reflection looks more like their shadow than your light. Carl Jung's language of the shadow becomes essential here. To empathize endlessly with someone who cannot reciprocate is to absorb their shadow as your own. And when you carry what isn't yours, your psyche begins to fracture. The toll is confusion, self-doubt, and shame. But here's the truth you must hear. The presence of those feelings is not proof that you are broken. It is proof that you have been carrying more than one person's psyche, yours and theirs. And no nervous system can sustain that burden indefinitely. Modern neuroscience offers a way forward. Studies on trauma recovery show that when survivors begin to redirect empathy inward, through practices like mindfulness, journaling, or therapy, the brain begins to rewire. The hippocampus, often shrunken under chronic stress, starts to regenerate. Memory sharpens. The fog lifts. This is not just emotional healing. It's biological repair. Your body knows how to restore balance once the cycle of exploitation is broken. Marcus Aurelius, facing wars, betrayals, and endless political manipulation, wrote in his Meditations, "If it is endurable, then endure it. Stop complaining. If it is unendurable, then stop it." Applied here, the wisdom cuts through the fog. The toll of empathizing with a narcissist is not endurable forever. It consumes too much of your body, too much of your spirit. To stop it is not cruelty, it is survival. And survival, in this case, is the beginning of transformation. Because once you step out of the trap, you begin to see empathy for what it was always meant to be. Not a prison, but a gift. Not something to waste on those who devour it, but something to offer where it creates light, growth, and true connection. Sigmund Freud was among the first to recognize the difficulty of treating narcissism. In his 1914 essay on narcissism, he admitted that patients with these traits resisted therapy because they lacked what he called object love, the ability to genuinely invest in another person. They preferred to withdraw into themselves, preserving the fragile illusion of superiority. For Freud, this created a therapeutic wall. How do you help someone who cannot truly see you? More than a century later, therapists still ask the same question. But while narcissists themselves rarely change, those entangled with them can. And that's where the cycle begins to break, not with their transformation, but with yours. Carl Jung believed that the key was individuation, the process of becoming whole by separating what belongs to you from what belongs to others. In relationships with narcissists, this means identifying where your empathy ends and their shadow begins. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Yet many who try to empathize with narcissists lose that privilege, dissolving into roles written for them: caretaker, fixer, rescuer. The first path to clarity is realizing that these roles are not your identity. They are masks placed upon you. The moment you see the mask, you can begin to take it off. Modern therapy builds on this insight. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, for example, teaches survivors of narcissistic abuse to recognize distorted thinking. When a narcissist tells you, "You're selfish," CBT helps you pause and ask, "Is this true? Or is this projection?" This simple reframing disrupts the cycle of self-doubt. A 2018 meta-analysis in clinical psychology review showed that CBT reduced symptoms of anxiety and depression in survivors of manipulative relationships by nearly 50%. Clarity begins with questioning the script. Trauma-focused therapies like EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, go even deeper. Developed in the 1980s, EMDR helps patients reprocess traumatic memories so they no longer trigger overwhelming stress. For survivors of narcissistic relationships, this often means revisiting moments of gaslighting or emotional invalidation and disentangling them from the shame that was implanted. Studies published in the Journal of EMDR Practice and Research show success rates as high as 80% in reducing trauma symptoms. This is how neuroscience rewrites what narcissists once tried to rewrite in you, by restoring memory and emotion to their rightful balance. Freud might not have imagined these modern tools, but he understood the necessity of facing truth. "Being entirely honest with oneself," he wrote, "is a good exercise." For those who have lived under the manipulation of narcissists, honesty means acknowledging how much you've lost: time, energy, health, identity. But it also means recognizing what remains: the resilience that kept you searching for answers, the empathy that proves your humanity, the capacity to grow beyond the trap. The Stoics echo this path to clarity. Epictetus taught his students, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." Applied here, this means being willing to let go of the role the narcissist gave you. They may call you cold, selfish, uncaring when you set boundaries. But clarity requires enduring those accusations without letting them define you. To reclaim your life, you must risk being misunderstood. And that is the very opposite of narcissistic control. Neuroscience offers further hope. Research on neuroplasticity shows that even after years of emotional abuse, the brain can rewire. Practices like mindfulness meditation reduce amygdala reactivity and strengthen the prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational thought. A study from Harvard in 2011 found that just 8 weeks of mindfulness training physically increased gray matter density in areas tied to self-awareness and emotional regulation. In other words, you can literally rebuild the parts of your brain that narcissistic manipulation once eroded. Carl Jung would describe this as integrating the shadow, not theirs but yours, because entanglement with a narcissist doesn't only expose their darkness. It also forces you to confront your own, your need to heal others, your fear of abandonment, your reluctance to set boundaries. Breaking the cycle means turning empathy inward, asking, why did I stay? What was I seeking? What within me needs healing? These are not questions of blame, but of liberation. The answers reveal the parts of yourself that can grow stronger, clearer, more resilient. The path from Freud's early observations to modern therapy reveals a consistent truth. Narcissists rarely change, but you can. You can reclaim your reflection, restore your clarity, rebuild your strength. The cycle breaks not when they awaken, but when you do. And clarity, once found, is contagious. You begin to see the patterns not only in one relationship, but across your life. And each time you choose to step away from illusion, you step closer to the person you were always meant to become. Carl Jung once remarked, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life and you will call it fate. When you try to empathize with a narcissist, it feels like fate. You get caught in endless loops of giving, explaining, justifying, hoping. But the transformation begins the moment you realize this was never destiny. It was conditioning. And the antidote is distance. Distance is not coldness. Distance is clarity. Neuroscience shows why it works. A 2019 study from Stanford found that when survivors of toxic relationships created physical or emotional distance, their cortisol levels dropped significantly within weeks. Sleep improved, memory sharpened, even immune function stabilized. Your nervous system, constantly on high alert around a narcissist, finally begins to rest when space is created. What feels at first like abandonment or cruelty is, in fact, biology repairing itself. Distance is medicine. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." When you create distance, you encounter fear, fear of being misunderstood, fear of being called cold, selfish, uncaring. But that fear itself becomes the path. Because once you endure it, you discover what was hidden. Your power was never in changing them. It was in reclaiming yourself. Survivors describe this vividly. One testimony published in Psychology Today said, "When I finally cut contact, I felt like I couldn't breathe at first. Then slowly, I realized I was breathing for the first time in years." Another said, "Distance gave me back my reflection. I remembered what I liked, who I was, what I dreamed of before him." These stories align with what trauma specialists like Bessel van der Kolk, author of The Body Keeps the Score, have shown. Safety is the foundation of healing. Without distance, safety is impossible. Without safety, your brain cannot rewire. Jung would say that distance is how you reclaim your shadow. Because here's the paradox. When you step away from the narcissist, you are not only escaping their projection, you are meeting yourself. The parts of you that long to fix, to rescue, to redeem now stand exposed. And rather than condemning those parts, you integrate them. You learn to use your empathy wisely. You discover that compassion does not mean self-erasure. It means discernment. It means asking, does my empathy create growth here, or does it fuel destruction? Seneca taught, associate with people who are likely to improve you. Distance from the narcissist is not about hatred. It's about creating space for associations that uplift rather than devour. Neuroscience reinforces this wisdom. Research on social support shows that healing accelerates when survivors connect with healthy communities, friends, mentors, even therapy groups. Oxytocin, the bonding hormone once hijacked by toxic ties, begins to flow again in safe connections. Empathy finds fertile ground where it can actually bloom. And here lies the redefinition of empathy. You begin to see it not as an endless well to pour into others, but as a sacred resource to direct with wisdom. Marcus Aurelius, guiding himself through betrayal and war, wrote, The best revenge is not to be like your enemy. Applied here, it means refusing to let narcissists poison your gift. You do not stop being empathetic. You refine it. You choose where to place it. And in doing so, empathy becomes stronger, sharper, more luminous. Distance also brings a spiritual shift. Jung called it individuation, becoming whole. Freud would call it self-realization. The Stoics called it living in accordance with nature. Whatever language you prefer, the truth is the same. When you step back, you finally see. You see that your worth was never dependent on their recognition. You see that your empathy was never wasted. It was proof of your humanity. And you see that the greatest act of compassion is not saving the narcissist, but saving yourself. Transformation through distance is not the end of your story. It's the beginning. It's where empathy stops being a trap and becomes a compass. It's where the fog clears, where your reflection returns, where the shadow dissolves into light. And perhaps most importantly, it's where you realize that what once felt like fate was always choice. The choice to step back. The choice to see clearly. The choice to redefine empathy not as endless sacrifice, but as the conscious act of giving where it creates life. Because in the end, empathy is not about drowning with those who refuse to swim. It's about learning to breathe again, fully, freely, and without apology.